investments that we're making on our mission. Secondly, in the month of November, the November issue of Milwaukee Magazine, there is an article that is written in conjunction with our mission, Women on Boards in Wisconsin. I interviewed for that article, and that's in conjunction with the Betty Award. So, of course, our founder, Betty Quadracci, annually the Milwaukee Magazine highlights women in the community, and so this is an apt issue for us to be present. So look out for that in the November issue of Milwaukee Magazine. Also, we have launched our social media campaign, getting our brand, Milwaukee Women Inc., out into social media. And please remember, if you are a member of LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, to connect with us on that platform and propagate the good news about MWI. Also, we've been very active with our board bio workshops. ML Watman and her company, we partnered with ML to provide workshops for creating your board bio or refining it, as is the case with what I am doing. We've had 5 workshops completed. About 50 of our steering committee members have participated, and there are 3 more scheduled. So they've been very well attended, about 10 in attendance at each one. And I also want to remind you, if you have participated in the workshop, to please publish your bio. The goal of this is to create a very rich resource for not only external parties who are looking at our steering committee members and maybe in search of an executive or a board member for their board, but also for our own use internally within the organization, as we may have inbound inquiries from looking for board members, particularly women, and maybe we are full with what we can do, but maybe there's somebody in FWI that we can refer. So that is going to be a great resource because of the enhancements that we've made for searchability and skills, to be able to do that more effectively and efficiently. And then lastly, our research report was published last month. Some of the progress that we're making, you all should have received a copy of that, some great content and showcasing some of our sponsors and some of our CEO friends. So with that, I will turn the meeting over to Deb Seeger, who will introduce our presentation this afternoon. Deb?
Thank you. Oh, wow, isn't this so great? I've missed you all. When the program committee first started talking about our program earlier this year, the topic of ESG came up. Chris and I, especially were interested in this idea of what is it, who cares, why should we care, what does it have to do with us? And so we thought in really alignment with our mission, it is not necessarily MWI's mission to be the place to provide a primer on ESG, but really to examine where is there the potential for the ESG movement to have an impact on accelerating our goals more than boards. And so that's really how we came up with this discussion today. And in doing so, Krista, through some other connections, led us to find Dr. Chris Merker, who, as you'll see from his background, has been immersed in this before it even had a name. And I'll let Dr. Chris Merker introduce yourself. You are the Executive Director for Fund Governance Analytics at Baird and an adjunct professor at Marquette University's Finance Department.
So I've been at Marquette since '09. Sustainable finance professor at Marquette in a program that was, for its time, about 4 years old, called investment management program, which puts Marquette on the map as having the first course dedicated to ESG and ethics and investments, which is pretty interesting given where we are today, the whole space. In my role at Baird, I'm Director of Private Asset Management, actually, where nonprofit organizations, and I will tell you, ESG is front and center for organizations. So I'm very fortunate to teach, research ESG, and then apply it in very practical field of investing. So it's been great. But you're right, it has evolved. When I was teaching the class in my first year in 09, it was kind of crickets. And then you went a couple years ahead, and business people started to just kind of wake up a little bit. In the last few years, it's of course been a top kind of response for business. So
this is time. And we agree, we're going to unpack it a little bit because we know there's a varying spectrum of understanding of what is it. And so we'll get into that. But first, also, let me introduce most of you know Andrea Schneider, the director for the Institute of Women's Leadership at Marquette, which was created in 2019 to become the thought leader on women's leadership issues. And for that, Professor of Law for 25. Yeah. And so we're happy to have you come and join us on this fireside chat. Tell us a little bit about your kind of intersection with ESG.
Well, the thing that brought me to Milwaukee Women Inc., actually before even the Women's Institute was created, was my work in dispute resolution, and particularly looking at women in negotiation. And if you've been negotiating to try to get on board, as many of us have, or to get a raise or a promotion, you've probably read a lot about what we ostensibly do or don't do, and what skills we bring to the table or don't. And so that was something that in looking around in the community, I really buy into the mission of MWI of we need women on boards because we need women in leadership positions to change the culture. That timed well with the creation of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Marquette, and so I was very happy to become the director of that as well. And then to think strategically about how we use initiatives like ESG and the ongoing press coverage and push to think broadly about diversity on boards, and how can we take advantage of that as part of MWI to help all of us to move the needle.
So with that, as part of the setup, each of you has at your place a copy of the deck that Chris prepared, and he is going to speak to a couple of those slides. But before he gets to that specifically, I just want to get into what I'm calling kind of the setup. We are, as I observed, coming into a perfect storm of opportunity, you could call it, with the confluence of a number of events, certain events and changes. The increasing pace of board turnover over the next 10 years, there's going to be more board turnover than ever in our country's history. What does that mean? That means, passing on those directorships to a different generation, and a number of board opening period. At the same time that we're going to see the greatest generation transfer of wealth, also probably in our country's history, some estimated 30 trillion, which will be transferring into the hands of a younger profile investor who, by all accounts, is thinking differently about investing and the things that are important to them. Also, the increased data on company performance correlation to the percentage of women directors, and then the emergence of ESG-based performance goals. So there's never been a better time for us here to expect a significant increase in the number of women on boards, and especially as we look at our goals coming up to 2025 mission that we have. And is it time for us to even challenge ourselves to readdress those goals, given that we're almost at 25%? So with that, Chris, would you like to take us to specifically which slides you'd like to present?
sure, yeah. I don't think we're going to be projecting them, so I'll just speak to
We chose to have our Zoom friend.
That's right. This is why we're doing a little bit of hard copy. We'll break our no paper today. Okay. So I just prepared a little bit of a deck to sort of warm us up today in this whole topic of ESG. And I know many of you are probably very well informed, given what capacity you're working in. All the corporations are only involved in sustainability reporting and corporate responsibility type issues, or if you're on a board that's, probably recently formed an ESG committee, but now boards are now dedicating committee functions to this. So I apologize if some of what I'm going to say is a little bit too simplistic, but I wanted to at least get it started. With just kind of a first, we want to look at the first page here to ESG, the search for enterprise value. So there's going to be a lot of definitions you're going to hear regarding ESG. Some people think of it as impact investing. Some people think of it as a type of social responsibility directive. Other people may describe it as having some community impact or import. And so that's where you get a lot of sort of different statements about it. And a lot of people working and coming at it from different perspectives. Are we talking about climate? Are we talking about society? Are we talking about equity? Which issue is of particular importance? So I would tell you that there are sort of two different schools of thought, and a lot of this is growing out of the corporate, I should say the sort of religious or faith-based movements of a century ago, of social responsibility, not investing in sin stocks and those types of things. And so that's kind of where it was for a long time. And we can actually credit the faith-based movements for a lot of what we're benefiting from today. I sort of smile a little bit when, if you take any time to talk to some of the older nuns around the city and hear about some of the things they were being involved in back, especially in the 1970s, you'll find out what real activism is. Pretty amazing, the stories I'll tell you about shareholder activism. And a lot of those practices have now been formalized and institutionalized by professional money managers. It's just, in a way, when you think about the sort of 40, 50 years in between, it's a little strange, actually, when you think about it. But that's where we are. So I would tell you from a very baseline definition, ESG is about the search for enterprise value. So there's very much of a financial component to ESG investing. It's certainly how organizations like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board looks at it, where they talk about it in terms of the concept of financial materiality. And so what are we trying to get at here? With conventional accounting metrics, I think the problem that's primarily being addressed is how do we understand the risks to companies, the opportunities to companies, and what that means to us as investors. So what I'm showing you on the slide is some research that's been done by Ocean Tomo. This actually features in almost the first page of the FSA, which is the Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting Handbook, which is SASB's certification program. And it's interesting, look at the development since the 1970s. And if you try to estimate the value, the market value of companies, what you can attribute it to as a percentage of intangible assets, okay, not tangible. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm talking tangible assets, I'm talking book value. And so what you can see is a dramatic shift since 1975 to 2020, where back in the mid 70s, we could describe about 83% of enterprise value based on book value. And it makes sense if you think about it, because back in those days, we were what? We were predominantly manufacturing-based economy. Most of what value there was in our production capacity was tied up in physical assets, property, plant, equipment. And those were all things that you could measure at book value on your financial statements. And what's happened over that 40, 50-year period of time is that we have transformed this economy into a service-based economy. So today, only about 12% of GDP we attribute to manufacturing. 88% is service-based. And as a result, us being able to understand the value of the companies that exist today, it's become a different calculus. And so we're looking at intangibles, we're looking at brand value, we're looking at human capital, we're looking at all the things that have actually little to do with the building in which the business is located, may not even be located in the central market. We find more and more people are working separately, working from home. So that's really what ESG is trying to get at, is trying to create a new set of accounting standards to assess and understand corporate disclosure to arrive at some assessment or appraisal of enterprise value. So if you go to, and I promised I won't talk about Teresa. So probably for good reason, because I've already spent 5 minutes.
You should have seen his face when I said, could you pick 2 songs?
Thank you for giving me the clue. If you go to the next page, this is really what we're talking about. So we're talking about resources. So it's become very much of a resource-based view of the firm. And we talk about these in terms of 5 capitals. What are the 5 capitals? And no, it's not Washington, D.C., Madison, and Tulsa. We're talking about the 5 capitals of companies. And so we're either talking about financial capital, or we're talking about manufactured capital, or we're talking, as we're going to talk a lot about today, social capital, human capital, and then we're talking about natural capital, finally social capital. And amidst all those capitals, we have 3 different bodies that work on that. We have our value creators, which represent our employees, our customers, suppliers. And then we have our governance providers, which is hopefully you folks, as you make inroads into board service, the board of directors and management. And then we have our capital providers, who are the folks providing capital. That's, of course, shareholders, lenders, and so forth. So how we think about the stewardship and management of the 5 capitals is what leads to value creation, and all that's involved in measurement. So lastly, I'm just going to point to a little bit of our own work at Marquette. So I'm more of a G guy, a governance guy. It's where I did my PhD research, and where my focus started is from the ESG and governance area. And so one of the things that, and this was the focus of my dissertation topic at Marquette, it's where we've taken the research since that time. Oh, I'm sorry, page 8. So what we looked at was corporate governance is pretty well-tilled field here in America. There's not a whole lot to uncover as it relates to page 8. The headline is diversity on boards, asset owners. Page 5, I'm sorry. You're not holding stupid names. I am. Because I'm the student. Sorry. Page 5. Diversity on board, asset owners.
Bottom of page 4.
Okay. All right. We might need to do a poll. So when I undertook a dissertation project several years ago, I was interested in applying some of the things that we learned in corporate governance to a different type of organization. And if you look at the world is divided between corporations and asset owners, if we try to understand where financial assets are today. And there is a huge amount of money that is being run by public pension funds, by endowments, by foundations, and not a lot of research or metrics involved in the boards that run and are responsible for those organizations. And in particular, as it relates to public pensions, there's a growing retirement security issue that's happening that sort of brings up the city of Milwaukee right now. We've heard that there may be some layoffs in the not too distant future because of our pension fund problems. So we were interested in studying governance and how it applied to those boards for those organizations. And whereas there's a ton of research, huge industry that's run up around corporate governance, very little has been done here in asset ownership. And so we saw this as a real opportunity when you're academic of finding if you want to do something new, you have to, of course, go find some research. So we've been collecting data now for more than a decade on asset owners. We're actually in the midst of a study with Common Fund Institute on governance and higher education, so we're broad enough, public pensions, other areas. And so one of the things that we look at, and this, unfortunately, when we were doing our research on boards, we had to rely on disclosures of these bodies, and they didn't always describe their gender or board characteristics in that way. So, so we didn't have a good measure on diversity. But what we've been able to do since, because we developed a pretty good measure of governance, is we've been able to attach in our surveys questions on diversity. And so what you're looking at here is we've been collecting this data now for about 5 years. looking at the diversity of boards on women and diversity for people of color. And what you find, because our metric was pretty good on the governance aspect, is that when you look at the top quintile governance organizations, you find across the board, they also have the highest representation of women and people of color. So,
in your opinion,
so
have we moved beyond the casual correlation to causation?
well, certainly, I mean, many people smarter than me have gone out and studied that as it relates to corporations, as it relates to investments, and they found that. But I will tell you that we're the first to identify that with respect to asset ownership organizations, because our financial metrics and governance metrics tie that directly to investment performance. So yes, we found that research. So that's my sort of brief intro here on ESG.
Thank you, because again, trying to take a very broad, multifaceted, to find different definitions of this all over everywhere you went. And the reason Krista and I wanted these two speakers here is because we knew you would bring each a different lens to this. So that was a really good foundation of build up. Thank you. So Andrea, based on that, and when we first contact you and said, would you want to, share some of your thoughts on this topic? Bring this to where the Institute for Women's Leadership is.
So my first response was, yes, what? Is that a text message thing that I'm supposed to understand from like my kids? And right, like I was absolutely like, I mean, and we've talked about, because in my world, I think about DEI and DE, which is now DEI, or equity and inclusion. And all right, are we making sure we have all of the right alphabet soup? Now, in that field, how does this actually connect with governance? Because I think to both of your points, I was about to say, no one's arguing anymore about the correlation causation of diversity in boards and decision making. Or I should say the flip side is, if you are, you've had your head in the sand for about 5 years of, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, you name it, everybody out there has made that case in terms of diversity of boards leading to better return on investment. I think what this really brings, and particularly Chris's terrific work, nothing like a PhD to motivate you to, all right, I got to do something new and different, and to really look at how these broader social movements can also be useful umbrellas, I think, for us to continue to advance our agenda and to recognize that some people who we're talking to are going to be convinced by return on investment. And some people who we're talking to are going to be convinced with the, I can't have a mantle anymore. I can't actually have any public event in which there are only men. It would be nice if they would believe that. And others, this is going to be a terrific avenue of, look, you're part of this ESG, of changing the whole way that we're thinking about social responsibility, about governance, about the climate and environment. And this fits. And frankly, your diverse boards are more likely to also buy in to an ESG platform that's going to make a difference in your company. So I think it's a really useful framework for us.
So in listening to you, there were a couple of things I read just in the last 2 days. I thought that, as soon as you buy a red Jeep, you see red Jeeps everywhere. So all of a sudden ESG is popping up in everything in my newsfeed. But one of them I thought was really interesting was this idea that it was only 100 years ago that we had a 6-day work week. And I think what I read was that Henry Ford was the first person to introduce, going to less than that, and how shocking people think it is today for us to be even considering a 4-day work week, and just the pace of change and the time for change. And so I came across this quote that I thought would be really helpful. And it was from Patrick Gadsden, who was with an entity called Vincent and Elkins. Said, what we're seeing now with public companies is a cultural shift that is catching up with them. All of the tipping points for the various ESG issues are all tipping at the same time. No one is immune. so this is really more than a movement, would you say that this is really, kind of the confluence of a number of things going forward, there's no going back, and how can we kind of think about not just riding the coattails, right, but being intentional to prepare for an openness, a readiness before we have to get to programs. And I think we had this discussion in some of our programming before about what California is doing, or maybe, gosh darn it, should we just say, focus further away? Just kind of your thoughts, knowing what our mission is here and what we're trying to figure out here today.
I'll hop in. Vincent and Elkins is a law firm
Okay.
out of Houston. They are quite conservative, and I would challenge that particular partner to look at the percentage of female equity partners at his law firm. Because my guess is they are under 30% female equity partners, and that if it matches the statistics in Milwaukee, less than 10% of those make up the highest paid partners at his own law firm. So,
Drop your mic right
so let's just be clear on who's, no, I mean, I think, yes, there is change, and yes, there is a tidal wave of movement, and let's not pretend that magically everybody's now reading. Yeah, all of this needs to change. So if you're on a board, are the people you're hiring diverse? Are your financial advisors diverse? Are your accountants diverse? Are the lawyers that you're hiring, are you giving women the billing credit, the origination credit? Are they getting paid for the work that they're doing? That is where the change needs to be. We need to be on the boards and in the executive suite so that we are making the decisions in order to actually walk the walk all the way down. It's not just the showcase of, and frankly, the board in some ways is, if they can't figure out how to get a diverse board with decades now of numbers that demonstrate that it helps the bottom line, really? What are we looking at? So now let's start at how you're spending your money. And are you actually putting your money where your mouth is? And that is why, right? That's the next argument of where, again, I think ESG can play out of, okay, so this is the latest fad. I mean, it's not, it's been here for forever. How do you want to make sure that it's not a fad? How do you want to make sure that it is integrated into decision-making? You need to change the people who are making those decisions. There is no incentive for the people who have been doing the same exact thing for 25 years to change their mind. You need to change the decision makers. So maybe this lovely partner who we quoted has actually done some change at his own law firm. But Vincent and Elkins is not, as far as I recall, one of those firms that has, they track the top 100 in terms of equity partners. And I'm happy to eat my words. I'd be delighted to be wrong. And
I'm gonna jump in. So I have a personal investment in this whole topic, just for full disclosure, because I'm the father of two daughters, only two daughters. So whatever happens today is going to affect the course of their lives. So I do have some thoughts on this. Certainly, I think ESG has done a wonderful job of focusing people's attention. But there's some risks in there, right? And there's a lot of talk, and that brings up some risks, which I think we're probably going to get into at some point on things like greenwashing. I would just highlight, without even talking about diversity, we have an important global conference going on this week. So for a timely topic this week with the UN COP26 conference in Glasgow. I think to highlight the point a little bit, it's very telling that the two parties that are not attending the conference this year is China and Russia. Okay, so China has said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, and at some point we're going to really start bringing our emissions down. In the meantime, China is building the amount of coal capacity right now that's equal to the amount of installed coal capacity we have in the United States. So they plan to build it in 1 year. In the meantime, India, which finally made some kind of commitment, said, we're going to get to it, but by 2070. Okay, so the problem with someone, and this is a very distinct problem I think with ESG, is yes, it's focusing the issue, but it's also creating an opportunity for obfuscation and escape from commitment. And so that's the downside of pretty much everything we're talking about, because we can say we're doing something on diversity, we can disclose our data on diversity, or on carbon emission, or you pick the topic where we're struggling as a civilization. And that disclosure did not do anything other than be a disclosure. So I think that's part of the risk. But I want to address in particular one thing you asked about, which is this issue of quotas. And so being a sort of laissez-faire capitalist person that I'm very happy to admit I am, I sort of, pull back when I hear about quotas and things like that. But I will say, when you look at California, which enacted its law about 3 years ago, and they started softly with this, right? In 15, I'm talking SB 826, which is, I'm sure everybody's familiar, that now requires a certain percentage of the board of California companies have a woman that's planning to enact legislation by the end of this year, which is very soon, that will also apply to minorities. And in 15, when they first enacted what was a recommendation in the law, which was to say, we think this is a good idea, but it's non-binding. The needle did not move for 3 years at all. 15% of boards had women representation. Now they enacted the law, and here we are 3 years later, and that number is almost doubled. Okay. Now, in the meantime, NASDAQ, which took a lot of heat last year when the exchange announced they were going to have some type of system, and it ended up not being a quota system, it ended up being something that's known as Comply or Explain. And Comply or Explain, the way that works is it says, look, we're not mandating you to do anything, but what we are saying is if you aren't doing this, then you're going to have to explain why you're not doing it, and you're going to have to at least disclose what. And they've done this, and the SEC just affirmed it in August. The UK financial authority is now following this. And you've actually seen a couple of states who've not gone the route of California, have gone the route of Comply or Explain. And so I do think, we were talking about this before we started, you have a systemic problem. And that word, unfortunately, is tossed around a little bit too much at this time. But I think genuinely here you have a systemic problem, and it addresses the issue you're talking about. You look at it, the number of CEOs in the world between public companies here in the US and Europe, it's about 6% are women, only 6%. And the pipeline into boards for many is the CEO track. And so if you're to get to the board, you have to go through the CEO suite or the C-level suite. And if that CEO level or C-level suite is shut off, then you get the sort of retread type of system that we've had, despite the scads and scads of data that says, look, you really should diversify, and here are the reasons. But I think there's reason for hope, and whether we go Comply or Explain or quotas or volunteer system, you mentioned Wisconsin, I was not familiar with the number. It seems like we're doing relatively well compared to California on a voluntary basis. I think there's reasons for hope, and that's because of the focus that this has brought attention to. So when you have the large asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and Fidelity, which kind of divide up the world themselves, at least among passive investments, they're saying, look, we might actually require, because we have a lot of votes when it comes to our corporate governance resolutions and our proxies each year, where if you don't have 30% representation, we're just going to vote against your board. And if you get an asset manager who has that kind of clout, who's already under a lot of scrutiny by other people because of the amount of clout they have, then you're going to start to see real change. So I do think there's a very positive opportunity here that ESG is presenting.
And I would say, in defense of transparency, it's not enough, but it is a crucial first step, right? That if we don't even have the numbers, if we don't have the data in front of us, then we can't make that argument. And I think MWI in Wisconsin has made that really clear. Just the reporting and naming the companies, here's who's achieved it. Wouldn't you want to be on that list? Shame is a lovely thing, not to be underestimated. back to the NWI event, what was it, 2 years ago, and Joel Quadracci came out to give an award. Hey, by the way, where's your board standing? Right? Like that was a little bit of cognitive dissonance there. And I think that's really helpful. So I think transparency is a crucial first step, and then figuring out whether it is those, is it carrots, is it sticks, is it the mix, is it what is really going to move the needle in different ways. And when everybody's trying to move that needle, of course, that's terrific, right? Then you see that mix.
And I think where I'm really intrigued by some of your comments, especially when you say too large. I think we've had that discussion in this group many times, is when there's a group of people of a certain age who then have young daughters coming up in the business world, and they see, what their roadblocks are. They kind of ask themselves, when might there be a day when my daughter looks at me and says, Dad, what the hell? And that's another reason for change. I'm struck by that because I'll just make a correlation. Maybe it's off base, but if you think about what's happened in the Me Too movement, for a lot of women, it took a long time before all of a sudden we're like, what the? And I think there's so many women who feel like we shouldn't have to fight this fight by ourselves. Where are the men who see the data, know the data, it's irrefutable data, and yet still haven't, organized until there's some other influences forcing them to organize an ESG, committee, and move the needle themselves. And so, where do you think that is today? Do you think it's being a kind of a sense of forced, we should do this before we get quotas that are enacted? Or is it coming intrinsically, or from a man's perspective? And I told you,
Speak for all men.
Speaking, right, from a
I do better when I stick with data, and not try to speak for my sex. So I mean, look, I would say it's clearly, if you do look at it, it's front center for all of us.
It's been clear to us.
But I mean, specifically, like, if you look at certainly the number of companies that are reporting around this issue, it's a lot more than it was 6 years ago. Okay, so just to show you how rapidly reporting has changed, you go back to 2015, and only 20% of the S&P 500 companies were producing a corporate sustainability report that would have had any data on diversity statistics or environmental analysis. Within about 3 years, that number went from 20 to 80%. So this has been a rapid change. And now what you're seeing in the last couple of years is, let's talk about Europe for a second. So Europe was not tying anything to ESG metrics in terms of executive compensation a few years ago, something like 3%. Now you've got roughly 30% of it. Okay. If you look at the S&P 500 again today, about half of them are now linking ESG metrics to executive compensation. And the top issues, I would say the top two are diversity and carbon. So those are already top of the agenda. Now, you dive into the statistics a little bit and you find out, number one, a lot more qualitative in terms of how they're making a determination of comp, which to me is like, why are we being qualitative? It's a number. It's really to qualify here at all. But that's what's happening. So we need to see a little bit of improvement there. And number two, so you're seeing more use of the metrics, but the second issue is you're only seeing them applied more to annual incentive compensation and not to the LT. So it's a very short-termist issue right now. But that's a lot. So again, when you think about the time where we were at 15 to today, that's mind-boggling change. nowhere near perfect, but certainly on a great track.
Thanks for using the data to support that.
Like how I dodged them.
That's good. And so, Andrea, you've been to Red,
Might be out of juice.
project. I'll use my mom voice. You've been to other cities as you work on the initiative of the Institute for Women's Leadership. Is this on the radar anywhere you're going? As other cities are,
I mean, I think different cities are tackling it differently. I mean, depending on the culture and, look, however long you've been in Milwaukee, right? Milwaukee is unique and different in its own way, in which, silent auctions don't necessarily raise as much, or whatever you're working on, right? You think about it's lovely and everybody knows everybody and those kinds of things. So I think sometimes peer pressure can work really well, where everybody knows everybody, and you're all on the same nonprofit boards and neighborhoods and parties, and you can buttonhole somebody at the soccer game of like, it's also a place that does not necessarily embrace change as rapidly as other places. And so change for the sake of change is not seen as a positive, right? And there are other places that sell their entire selves of like, we're different from where we were 3 years ago and 5 years ago, and we're going to turn over our population completely. Well, yeah, then you've got to, right? If that's Austin or Denver or wherever our children are thinking that they want to move, it's because these places are selling change and have to deliver on that change. We don't sell change. We don't have to deliver on that change. And so, Chris is lovely. Like I'm the dad of 2 daughters, and I'm the mom of 3 sons. So it's and they called their father to learn how to do laundry. Very proud. I'm like, best parenting moment ever. But the fact of the matter is, like, we have to think about systemic change, because there have been CEOs, male CEOs, for hundreds of years with daughters, right? Half the population had CEOs had daughters. That's not enough to change it. That I want something better. I mean, you have to realize that you do want something better, that your daughter wants something better, that your son should actually value an opinionated, mouthy woman who wants to work. Working on that one, right? And how do we socialize everybody to want that equality, that change, that difference, that socialization? But boy, oh boy, that's been a long time in coming. And so I get we're all, ooh, quotas, blah. So what? Like if that actually is going to move the needle, then think about a quota that expires. Then think about soft quotas. Think about reward quotas. Think about, don't call it a quota. Call it a highly, ambitious target to which your money is tied. Call it whatever you want. But the fact of the matter is, we've had structural, systemic, ingrained bias for, I don't know, forever. A little kick in the pants of some structural change rather than just relying on, I don't know, desires kind of thing. It doesn't strike me as fast enough.
and as a group of very impatient women, I
Yeah.
think we all agree with that. We have 5 minutes left, and we did want to see if there's anybody who has a question that you'd like to present. We said this is a topic that we could have gone on and on for a long time. So before I ask one more question, does anybody? Right. I think we didn't hear your comment.
Do you have any questions? Or I have time for one more question. If you have one, holler it out. There you go.
Go ahead.
Do you look at all at the types from a leadership perspective that are filled? See a lot of certain staff roles that tend to be extremely open to diversity in those leadership roles, but some of those key critical business decision maker roles not being roles of some of those. It just seems to be the same team. I'm just wondering if that's at all.
I mean, so the
Yeah.
question, sorry for everybody on Zoom, is do you tend to see women in the same types of leadership roles? The ones that are not decision-making and that have less power? Is that a fair
Or their role
paraphrase?
or their role in business.
Their role in
is to
business,
Protect the business,
To protect the business.
But maybe not steer.
but maybe not
decision.
steer it, right? So more in the
That's a
supportive
very
business
different
role. Right. I mean, I think, so yes, cynical self here is like, if you haven't figured out how to put a woman in HR, you're an idiot. I mean, come on, everybody has been doing that for decades. It was the first woman in the C-suite that people figured out how to do. And they're doing that in, you talked about greenwashing. There's the whole like, oh, where are we first, that there are people appointed in roles to, yes, to look good rather than because they're bringing the skill set. And that's, I think you get some of those problems as well. I think that's absolutely when you look at who's making those leadership decisions. Yes, I still think you're seeing that bias where it's the supportive, it's the less, it's the, it's the general counsel is a woman, but she's not actually part of the business decision, however that model has occurred. Or the CFO is now a woman, but not, right? So I think there's two different things that are happening in terms of they might be bringing women in, but then they create executive leadership team, in which it's not 5 people in the room anymore, it's 3 people in the room, and they're still all male. So I think, again, you've got to continue to call that out. That's not true in every place. I think there are still some siloization, some assumptions that women are better at certain tasks.
So I'll just add to that and just talk about my industry, investment profession. And I would say that it's one thing that I watch for every spring when I teach my sustainable finance course, which every AIM student has to come through and see me at some point. Most of their students, but, so I get to see everybody, and I get to see
a very popular professor. He's being very self-deprecating.
I get to see what the makeup or complexion is, and I can see literally the trends of what's happening, microcosm for the overall industry. And one data point and very interesting is the percentage of women in the course, because that is very telling and very reflective of what's happening more broadly. And CFA Institute, which I've been a member forever, and it plays an important role in the investment industry. They've been talking about this issue for years. How do we get more women in the investment profession? And the stats are very sad. I mean, it's 19% are charter holders, and that sort of matches the percentage of women in the profession in general. It's about 90%. Maybe it's come up a little bit recently, but it's stayed down at that level for a very, very long time. If you go to the emerging markets, it's actually quite a bit higher. It's like 30%. And I ask myself time and time again, why do we have this problem? The CFA Institute holds roundtables and we visit firms, and we've had our colleagues attend these events. And I think it's great that we're talking together as an industry, but it doesn't get at the heart of the problem, which is that we're not recruiting young women into the profession. And instead, the only exposure they're having, I was reminded again this week when my law school class did the Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, which I'm sure some of you have seen. And so their perception of the industry, young girls' perception is, oh my God, it's like that. And so we have I think we have a very big problem with perception of what the investment or finance industry is about. And that turns young women off. And they don't think that they can live in a massive, sort of macho culture like that. And I think that does explain it. And there's so much that could be done by just going in through STEM programs or recruiting in the classrooms that could alter that from a very early age. And I think that probably could be applied, the same principle could be applied to many professions. But I've just noticed that within my industry, being teaching as long as I have, that's been sort of a perennial problem for one.
Yeah, that a lot of it, and I really appreciate it. By giving me your And still, the numbers in the law firms are disastrous. Like 25% women, 75% men. Like I said, the moneymakers are the ones that are just retaining those clients. So I assume it's somewhat similar to financial.
At least we're not watching offensive movies anymore about employers, but yeah.
And, oh,
I just have a question, two questions. One, in your research, and here's a for you, Adria, do you have any, is there any type of categories around men, executives, who are married to women who work? It's very easy for us to talk about corporate structures and systems, and completely ignore the familial structures and challenges that women encounter. And to the point of law firms, and especially financial services, a lot of men have been made successful by books of businesses that have been given to them.
Yeah.
Versus a woman who has worked 3 times as hard and hasn't been given anything. It happens at every single company. And we have young female attorneys who are 30 years old, who are promised equity partner track, but then the male shareholders are responsible for their journey. So it's all happening today still. There's so many informal nuances in this discussion that almost is never discussed.
So
It's easy to talk about the data, and trust me, I love data and research too. This part gets messy, but it's so deeply intertwined and we don't talk about it. Are we starting to measure it?
yes, I mean, in part, and it's funny, Emily, I would split this up in 2 pieces. One is just looking at you said the familial structure of, I mean, there are jobs, any of these jobs, we should look at who's supporting and, 2-career families, paid family leave, right? All of those things makes it tenable. I mean, for as much, I kind of joke about Milwaukee, we have 3 kids and 2 full-time jobs because we live in Milwaukee. Let's be clear, I don't have a single classmate who stayed in New York or Washington, D.C., where there are 2 full-time working parents, period. Right, so let's celebrate that we're in Milwaukee. That's great, because we can actually go home and, either one of us can be at the school 15 minutes from when the teacher says your kid broke their leg. You're like, oh crap, right? Like you can drop everything and go at either place. And so I think that we should be talking transparently about our partnership in our careers. And I have now stopped beating around the bush. I tell my female students that one of their most important career choices will be who they partner with. That if they want to stay working, they better be thinking very carefully about how they manage the rest of their lives, because that absolutely matters. I mean, the other piece of this is that origination credit and the networking and the things that go on. And yes, we are talking about it more because law, as opposed to finance, has solved the recruitment piece, right? Law firms are starting at 45% women. Law schools are 50% women. And everybody starts off getting paid the same, and you start off with those numbers, and you get 5 years in, and then 10 years in, and you're falling off the deep end. Some of that, just they leave. And we've been telling ourselves the story of them, they go in-house. And by the way, that's also BS. They don't, they leave. They're going to either their own firm, because if you're going to work yourself to the bone, keep all the money, right? Have more control over your schedule, so on and so forth. So you really need to be transparent about billing credit, origination credit, how you're getting paid. And here's where those of you that are companies versus law firms need to make a difference. So it's not enough that you think the team you've hired has a woman on it. Congratulations. Is she getting credit? Is she getting the client? Is she getting you? Even if you're the one who's talking to her all the time, she might not be getting paid for that or for doing the majority of the billing. And so it's really, general counsel's offices are not always comfortable digging into the weeds of how people get paid. But you need to, and that's where the power is. And I should say there's a lot of initiative here in town that GC, the general counsels of the, everyone getting on their laptop is getting, by the way, it's hilarious. Like, that's okay. Wow.
That was awesome.
I think she may have kicked off.
And
the
she
Zoom.
might have ended Zoom, which means you know, we're out of time anyway. So we'll just end with, that's an additional power and pressure. Oh my God, she's so cute. I love that it's done.
Well, as Krista and I expected, this topic is rich, it is layered, it is nuanced, it is tricky, it can make us uncomfortable, but we didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. But it's important and it's not done. And we probably could see our way to having you come back as we kind of track this topic, especially in ESG and its effect on accelerating our goals. I want to thank Jackie because, you know, this is the first time we had to figure out how to try to get everybody participating on Zoom also in the room. I want to thank Krista for helping me to organize this discussion and find these two wonderful speakers. Both of them will be here after our event to have more one-on-one conversation. And I hope we all can take something away from this that is positive for hope for an accelerated pace of change.
Oh, can I just make one comment? Yeah. So I didn't mention this early on in the introduction, but in the back of your packet, I forgot to put up the flyer. But for those of you who are really interested in this topic of sustainability, Marquette is in the process of launching executive education sustainability track. It's made up of 4 courses. You go through it, you get FSA certified, which is we're actually the first university partner with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So it's a wonderful opportunity right here in Milwaukee. They'll be launching in 2022. We just announced it. We did a big sustainability conference about 2 weeks ago. Just wanted to mention it to this audience because I thought that would be interesting.
Thanks, Chris. I should also point out, you've probably already seen, there's a save the date note for IWL, for the Institute for Women's Leadership Gala. I'll be in touch, no doubt, with all of you to come and celebrate in person. And our last of our speaker series on women and money will be December 2nd. That is remote on Zoom. Feel free to join any one of those breakout groups that we have.
So Andrea, Chris, thank you. As our guest, Chris, we have something for you. We appreciate, and again, hopefully now that you've learned a little bit more about Milwaukee Women and our mission, you go ahead and you continue to spread the word. And Patty, do you have any closing business or the adjourn?
This was great. I really got to say this was great.
It's great.
So much fun.
Oh, it's an easy watch.
That'll be the determining factor, right? That's good.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. I've got a lot of time. I pick up my daughter Grace at Milwaukee Ballet at 7.
You have a great
I have a Grace and a Sophia.
Oh, I love
Nine actually, the one's turning 9. Second.
Today's the second.
All right, so she turns 9 on Thursday. My younger one's.
My daughter is 30 and trying to preempt the day.
Oh. What is she doing now?
So she is being supervisor for the overnight. And so she's been on the Lowe's counter side. Last year on the B2 movement, it took some time. And I support everyone that I know. Yeah, what we didn't have was the internet to share stories, to realize.
You shared it with
Like,
friends.
right,
Snap it.
basically was, and for people to compare notes and to come together in a platform that allowed us to have this groundswell, right? And that's why we made social media, right?
Well, I think it explains a lot more why the movement itself is accelerating.
Right, and so again,
There's
it's
clearly
but
been
it's
an-
not human, like tipping points, right? Like, I feel like the confluence of all things surrounding us, all. It's
Chris, so to your point, everyone's sitting here.
Oh, is that right? It's interesting.
I mean, people haven't seen each other for a while.
Yeah.
right. I think it's interesting with some of the side conversations we are going. I'm actually really interested in how you specifically on this topic to get male perspective on how we can get engagement in. Like it can't always
Oh,
just
in
be
the
women,
organization.
no, just in this broader.
Or just in the
like,
topic.
it can't just be women.
Oh, no, I know, it's never female allies.
Yeah.
And no, I mean, I think like my first rate was like, yeah, a guy negotiated a higher salary. And then he raises it less. This guy came over and agreed that their department across campus absolutely don't care if male or female, if somebody else negotiated that. So I knew that it was a systemic one that says there's no way I'm paying this very much. Same job with you.
Yeah.
Just,
Are you seeing male advocacy that ESG is just something that we have to comply with, but it's the right thing because the different, it's the right thing. I feel it.
I mean, you know, yes and no. I mean, that's the problem. Is you're seeing some changes.
Okay,
Not
I should have said like very
Am I seeing more? Well, yeah.
She brings Jack.
And I will tell you, I mean, you know, places like there, where we talk about it all the time, where we get on these, you know, Fortune 100 companies to work for, we're measured based on these. BlackRock's the same way. I actually had BlackRock's and their numbers aren't great.
I think the question is, where are you, and also what are you trying to like, what are you doing about it, right? Right. Not just say you don't always meet some metrics. We don't even have the metrics, but you're not meeting them. But what are you trying to do? That to me is important.
although you do have to watch for the window dressing parts of it.
Right.
So it's that
Greenwashing. Yeah, you know, it's me. I've worked with it. My first job was for American Jean Kennedy Smith. She was very powerful and influential.
Yeah.
And I worked for her assistant. So, and then my next job, I had a boss. So I throughout my career, I've probably not seen the world the way it is. Like, and even in my group today, we got women in our group. I think we have heavier women minority representation. We also have
sometimes that.
So, actually, you know, part of the classic couple, I think that is unusual.
it is in the financial industry. And we all recognize that. I mean, our problem is less attracting which is industry high. Yeah, which is you're not getting the product in our school. People
I mean, that's.
work. At least for women, frankly, women are put to that's right. And but that's not the problem.
Oh, I think my kids have had the
Which is right, and they're not looking at white men for.
Right, which frankly, if it means you got right now, harder, I'm okay with that. Like, if it's helping that, like, actually, that's what
I look at it as not advantage. It's just, I mean, we have to work simply.
right.
Now, we may get eliminated or not, it may not rise to the pile. But there was that. I don't think it's fair.
No, I think we're gonna, right.
You grab a drink?
Yeah, and,
No, this is your-
as
I do, yeah.
I'd like to touch base anyway.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah, of course. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, I have to
I'm sorry, I don't know. But I mean.